Ahoy there, young listeners! Captain Bramble has another tale from the swirling deep, a story about wishes and the simple joys of life. Let Captain Bramble paint a picture for all of you. Once, nestled beside a shimmering, ever-moving sea, stood a tiny, run-down hut. The salty air carried the scent of the ocean right to its weathered wooden door. Inside lived a kind-hearted fisherman named Hans and his wife, Greta. Hans loved the gentle rhythm of the waves and the quiet whisper of the wind, finding peace in his daily catches, no matter how small. Greta, while appreciative of their home, often dreamed of things just a little bit grander, a little bit brighter. Their days were filled with the simple tasks of tending their home and Hans's patient fishing. The hut, though humble, was their entire world, a small speck against the vast blue horizon. Hans often hummed soft tunes as he mended his nets, a contented smile playing on his lips, while Greta would meticulously polish their few treasured possessions, sometimes sighing softly to herself.
Greta, Hans thinks the sea air smells particularly fresh today. Hans feels good about fishing this morning.
Greta hopes Hans catches many fish, Hans. Greta would love a nice, plump fish for supper tonight. This hat feels a little drafty, doesn't it, Hans? Greta thinks about how lovely a sturdy wall would be.
A draft is just the sea's breath, Greta. Hans finds it rather comforting. Hans will do his best to catch a good supper for Greta.
Hans, with his heart full of simple hopes, gathered his worn nets and headed towards the shore, the soft sand yielding beneath his feet. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the sky with hues of orange and pink, making the waves sparkle like scattered diamonds. The gulls cried overhead, a familiar sound that accompanied Hans on every fishing trip. He found his favorite spot, where the water was often calm and teeming with life. With practiced hands, Hans cast his net into the gentle waves, the weighted edges sinking silently into the clear, cool depths. He watched the surface, patient and still, feeling the gentle tug of the currents against his small, sturdy boat. Hans loved these quiet moments, where it was just Hans and the endless sea, a perfect harmony. The ocean breeze tousled Hans's hair as he waited, a peaceful tranquility settling over him. He felt the familiar pull of the net, signaling a catch, and began to reel it in with his strong arms, a sense of quiet anticipation growing.
Hans wonders what kind of fish Hans has caught today. Hans hopes Greta will be pleased with whatever Hans brings home. Greta often thinks about Hans out there on the water. Greta just hopes Hans stays safe and catches enough to keep our bellies full. Hans always thinks of Greta. Greta. Hans will be back before the sun is high in the sky, Hans promises Greta.
Hans pulled with a steady, rhythmic motion, the net slowly emerging from the water. It felt heavier than usual, a pleasant surprise. As the net broke the surface, Hans saw a shimmer, a flash of iridescent scales unlike any fish Hans had ever caught before. It was a flounder, but oh, what a flounder! Its scales glowed with a soft, otherworldly light, and its eyes, large and knowing, seemed to hold the wisdom of the deep. Hans carefully brought the fish closer, his brow furrowed in wonder, his breath catching in his throat. This was no ordinary catch, not by a long shot. The air around the boat seemed to hum with a subtle magic. Hans carefully held the net, not wanting to harm the extraordinary creature, feeling a strange connection to the shimmering fish. He had never seen such beauty in all his years of fishing, a true marvel from the depths. Hans's heart beat a little faster with excitement and awe.
Hans has never seen such a beautiful fish. Hans thinks Stella is truly magnificent. Please, Hans, do not keep Stella. Stella is a magical flounder, and Stella wishes to return to the sea. If Hans sets Stella free, Stella will grant Hans a wish, any wish Hans desires. A talking fish! Hans can hardly believe Hans's own ears. Hans never knew such wonders existed in the sea. Stella's voice is so gentle.
Hans stared, his mouth slightly agape, at this shimmering fish. A talking fish? And a magical one at that, offering a wish? Hans had heard tales of such things by the fireside, but to experience it himself was truly astonishing. The flounder, Stella, looked at Hans with pleading, gentle eyes, its fins fluttering ever so slightly. Hans felt a profound sense of awe and a deep well of kindness within him. To Hans, the idea of keeping such a wondrous creature captive felt utterly wrong. Hans thought of the vast, open sea, the home Stella clearly longed for, and a simple decision formed in Hans's mind. Hans had always been content with what Hans had, and a wish seemed like an unnecessary burden. The sun climbed higher, warming Hans's shoulders as he contemplated the magical encounter. Hans smiled, a genuine, warm smile at the beautiful Stella, feeling a pure joy in simply being in the presence of such magic without needing to exploit it.
Hans thinks Stella is too beautiful and too special to be kept in a net. Hans sees Stella, longs for the ocean.
Hans is truly kind. Stella thanks Hans for understanding Stella's heart's desire. Stella promises to remember Hans's generosity.
Hans doesn't need a wish, Stella. Hans is happy just as Hans is. Go, Stella, be free. The sea is calling Stella home.
With those kind words, Hans gently unhooked the net, and Stella, with a graceful flick of her tail, slipped back into the cool embrace of the sea. She paused for a moment, her iridescent scales sparkling under the water, as if giving Hans one last grateful look, then vanished into the shimmering depths. A faint, sweet melody seemed to linger in the air where Stella had been, a whisper of magic that filled Hans's heart with warmth. Hans watched the ripples expand, a sense of peace settling over him. He felt no regret for not asking for a wish, only a quiet satisfaction in having done a good deed. The sea seemed to hum a happy tune, and the gulls soared higher, as if celebrating Stella's freedom. Hans packed up his empty net, his spirits light, and began his walk back to the tiny hut, the extraordinary encounter playing over and over in his mind. The sun was now high, casting long shadows, and Hans felt a pleasant warmth from the day's adventure. Hans couldn't wait to tell Greta all about it, knowing she would be amazed.
What an amazing day! Hans still can't believe Hans spoke to a fish. Hans thinks Greta will be so surprised when Hans tells Greta about Stella.
Stella will always remember Hans's kindness. Stella hopes Hans finds joy in every wave and every sunset.
Goodbye, Stella. Hans hopes Stella has a wonderful time swimming freely in the big, wide ocean. Hans wishes Stella well.
Hans arrived back at the hut, the scent of a simple stew Greta was preparing wafting out to greet him. His face was alight with excitement, a wide smile that Greta hadn't seen in ages. He quickly put away his fishing gear, his heart still thrumming with the magic of the morning. Greta looked up from stirring the pot, a curious expression on her face, noticing Hans's unusual cheer. The small hut felt cozy and familiar, but Hans's story was about to turn their world upside down. Hans sat down, eager to share his incredible adventure, his voice filled with wonder as he recounted every detail, from the iridescent scales to Stella's gentle voice. He described the pleading eyes and the promise of a wish, and finally, his decision to simply let the magical fish go, out of pure kindness. Greta listened, her eyes growing wider with each word Hans spoke, the stirring spoon forgotten in her hand, utterly captivated by Hans's amazing tale of Stella.
Hans is home. Greta sees Hans has no fish, but Hans looks so happy. Tell Greta what happened, Hans. Greta, Hans caught the most amazing fish Hans has ever seen. Stella, the fish, could talk, Greta. Stella offered Hans a wish. A talking fish, Hans? And Stella offered Hans a wish? What did Hans wish for, Hans? Greta is quite curious.
Greta's eyes, at first wide with wonder, quickly narrowed with a mixture of disbelief and a spark of something else, ambition. She couldn't fathom Hans letting such a golden opportunity slip through his fingers. A wish. The possibilities swirled in her mind, far grander than their tiny, drafty hut. The humble stew on the fire seemed less appealing now, overshadowed by the potential of what could have been. Greta paced the small room, her thoughts racing, a new determination setting in. Hans watched her, a little puzzled by Greta's sudden shift in mood. He had expected Greta to be amazed, perhaps even proud of his generosity, not upset. The air in the hut, which had felt so light just moments before, now carried a subtle tension, a new kind of storm brewing. Greta stopped in front of Hans, her hands on her hips, a firm expression on her face, a clear sign that Hans had made a grave error in her eyes. Greta believed Hans had missed a very important chance for both of them.
Hans, let Stella go without a wish? Hans, how could Hans be so foolish? Greta can't believe Hans. We live in this tiny rundown hut. But Greta, Hans was content. Stella, the fish, truly longed to be free. Hans felt it was the right thing to do, Greta. Right thing or not, Hans, Greta thinks we could use a proper cottage. Go back to the sea, Hans. Tell Stella Greta wants a cottage.
Hans, gentle and easily swayed by Greta's insistence, felt a wave of reluctance wash over him. He had never gone back on a decision, especially one rooted in kindness. The thought of bothering Stella, the magical fish, after granting her freedom, felt wrong to Hans. But Greta's voice was firm, her eyes alight with a newfound desire, and Hans found himself unable to refuse her. He sighed, the weight of the request settling on his shoulders, and slowly rose to his feet. The afternoon sun was now a golden disk in the sky, casting long shadows towards the sea, beckoning Hans back to the water. The gentle lapping of the waves seemed to mock Hans's sudden unease. Hans picked up his net, though he knew he wouldn't be fishing this time, only wishing. He walked back to the shore, the path feeling heavier than it had that morning, Greta's words echoing in his mind. He reached the water's edge, the familiar comfort of the sea now tinged with a strange apprehension. Hans called out, his voice a little unsure.
Greta, Hans doesn't want to disturb Stella. Hans believes Stella deserves peace after Hans freed Stella. Hans is truly content with our hut. Nonsense, Hans. Stella, the fish, offered a wish. Greta simply wants Hans to claim what Stella promised. Go, Hans. Greta is waiting. All right, Greta. Hans will go. But Hans feels a little bad asking Stella for something. Hans hopes Stella isn't too annoyed with Hans.
Hans stood at the water's edge, the waves gently lapping at his feet. The sea, which had been so calm and welcoming that morning, now seemed a little more subdued, its surface a duller gray. Hans felt a pang of guilt, but Greta's words still rang in his ears. He cupped his hands around his mouth, calling out, his voice carried by the wind over the gentle undulations of the sea. "Stella, Stella, come to me! My wife Greta has sent Hans to ask a wish of thee." He waited, his heart thumping softly in his chest. After a moment, a ripple appeared on the water, and then a familiar shimmer. Stella, the magical flounder, rose to the surface, her luminous eyes fixed on Hans. She looked exactly as beautiful as Hans remembered, perhaps even more so, her scales catching the muted light. Hans felt a blush rise to his cheeks, feeling embarrassed to ask Stella for something after Hans had been so noble that morning. Stella looked at Hans with knowing eyes, patiently waiting for Hans to speak Hans's request.
Oh, Stella, Hans is so sorry to bother Stella. Greta, my wife, has sent Hans. Greta wants a proper cottage, Stella.
Go home, Hans. It is already done. Stella understands Greta's desire for comfort. Stella grants Greta's wish.
Thank you, Stella. Hans is truly grateful for Stella's kindness, even though Hans feels a little silly asking. Hans hopes Stella forgives Hans.
With Stella's words,
The magical flounder dipped back beneath the waves, leaving Hans standing alone on the shore. Hans felt a strange mix of relief and wonder. He turned and hurried back towards where their humble hut had stood. As he rounded the bend, his jaw dropped. Where their tiny, run-down shack had been, now stood a cozy, charming cottage. The walls were painted a cheerful blue, window boxes bloomed with bright red geraniums, and a neat little garden patch stretched out front. A wisp of smoke curled invitingly from a proper chimney. Greta stood at the newly painted front door, her face beaming with delight, her hands clasped in joy. The air hummed with a fresh scent of new wood and blooming flowers, a stark contrast to the old, salty smell of their previous home. Hans felt a surge of pride that he could provide such comfort for Greta, even if it was through magic. Greta pulled Hans inside, her laughter echoing in the new, spacious rooms, already envisioning their happy life in the lovely new cottage. Hans smiled, seeing Greta so pleased, a momentary lightness in his heart.
Hans! Look, Hans! It's beautiful! Greta can't believe Stella, the fish, did this. Greta loves our new cottage, Hans.
It truly is wonderful, Greta. Hans thinks Stella is very powerful. Hans is glad Greta is happy. Happy, Hans? Greta is overjoyed. But Greta wonders, Hans, if Stella could do something even grander. Greta thinks a stone house would be even better.
Hans's smile faltered, replaced by a slight frown. Just moments ago, Greta had been overjoyed with the cottage, and now she was already thinking of something more. A stone house seemed like such an extravagant jump from a cozy cottage. Hans looked around their lovely new home, admiring the sturdy walls and bright windows, and couldn't imagine needing anything more. The sea, just beyond their new garden, seemed to sigh, a low, mournful sound. Hans felt a familiar reluctance tugging at his heart. He didn't want to go back to Stella, the magical fish, again, especially so soon after the last request. He tried to reason with Greta, to remind her of the simple beauty they now possessed, but Greta's mind was already set on the next grand desire. Her eyes shone with a restless ambition that Hans hadn't seen before, a hunger for more. Hans knew Greta would not be easily dissuaded once Greta had set her mind on something. He resigned himself to another trip to the sea, his shoulders slumping slightly.
But Greta, Hans thinks our cottage is perfect. Hans sees such pretty flowers in the garden. Hans does not think we need a stone house.
Hans, a cottage is fine, but a stone house is truly grand. Greta can just imagine the strong walls and towering fireplaces. Go back to Stella, Hans.
Oh, Greta. Hans feels bad asking Stella again. Hans worries Stella, the fish, will be cross with Hans for always asking for more.
Despite Hans's reluctance, Greta's will was stronger. With a heavy heart, Hans turned once more towards the sea. The path felt even longer this time, and the gentle lapping of the waves sounded less like a lullaby and more like a sigh of disappointment. The sun, which had shone so brightly on their new cottage, now seemed to hide behind a growing veil of clouds, casting a muted, somber light over the shore. The air grew cooler, and a slight breeze rustled the tall grasses, whispering secrets of impending change. Hans reached the water's edge, the gray waves now looking a little choppier than before, mirroring the turmoil in Hans's own heart. He cupped his hands, his voice a little softer, a little more ashamed this time. "Stella, Stella, come to me. My wife, Greta, has sent Hans to ask a wish of thee." He waited, watching the restless water, hoping Stella would appear, but also dreading Hans's wife's next demand. The sea seemed to churn with a subtle unease, reflecting Greta's boundless greed and Hans's growing unhappiness, as if sensing the imbalance. Hans felt a chill creep into Hans's bones.
Stella, Hans is truly sorry to bother Stella again. Greta, my wife, now wishes for a grand stone house, Stella.
Go home, Hans. It is already done. Stella sees Greta's wishes growing. Stella grants Greta's next desire.
Thank you, Stella. Hans truly hopes Stella does not think Hans is too greedy. Hans is just doing what Greta asks Hans.
Again, Stella, the magical flounder, dipped back into the depths, leaving Hans alone with the churning sea. Hans turned and walked back, his steps heavy, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where their home should be. He braced himself for the next transformation, a mix of apprehension and a strange fascination filling him. As he approached, he gasped. The cozy blue cottage was gone, replaced by a magnificent stone house. Its sturdy walls rose proudly, adorned with intricate carvings, and tall, arched windows looked out over a sprawling, manicured lawn. A grand oak door stood open, revealing glimpses of richly decorated rooms within. The air felt heavier, more imposing around this new structure. Greta stood on the threshold, a regal smile on her face, surveying her new domain with an air of immense satisfaction. She wore a finer dress, as if the house itself had bestowed it upon her. Hans felt a pang of longing for the simple cottage, but Greta's joy was undeniable. Hans knew Greta felt powerful. Greta gestured for Hans to enter, her eyes sparkling with triumph, already thinking of what Hans could achieve next for Greta. Hans slowly walked towards Greta, feeling a growing distance between Hans and Greta's happiness.
Hans, look at this, Hans. Greta told Hans a stone house would be so much better. Greta feels like a queen already in this grand place. It is certainly very grand, Greta. Hans hopes Greta finds true happiness here, Greta. Hans misses the blue cottage a little. Nonsense, Hans. This is what true happiness looks like. But Greta wonders, Hans, if Stella could give Greta something even more impressive. Greta thinks a magnificent castle would suit Greta far better. Welcome to Go Readling Stories, The Fisherman and His Wife.
Hans could only stare at Greta, a profound weariness settling over him. A castle! It was barely an hour since Stella, the magical fish, had granted their last wish, and Greta was already demanding something more. The endless cycle of desire felt like a heavy weight pressing down on Hans. The grand stone house, which had seemed so impressive just moments ago, now felt like another fleeting stage in Greta's insatiable quest for more. The sea outside, visible through the tall windows, had grown darker, its waves crashing against the shore with a new, insistent roar. The once gentle rhythm was replaced by a churning, angry sound, a reflection of Greta's escalating greed. Hans tried to appeal to Greta's sense of reason, but Greta simply waved his concerns away, her eyes already envisioning herself within the towering walls of a magnificent fortress. Hans felt a deep sadness for Greta's inability to find contentment. He knew he had no choice but to obey him, his simple, kind heart aching with each successive demand. Hans walked towards the door, his shoulders slumped in defeat, knowing what Hans must do, and dreading his next encounter with Stella.
Greta, Hans thinks Hans should not ask Stella for a castle. Hans feels Stella, the fish, will be quite annoyed with Hans and Greta's endless demands. This house is already so grand. Hans, Greta feels a castle is a natural progression. Think of the towers, Hans, and the drawbridges. Go to Stella, Hans. Greta wants a castle. But Greta, Hans worries about Stella. Hans thinks Hans is pushing Stella too far. Hans truly thinks this stone house is more than enough for Hans and Greta.
Hans trudged back to the shore, the wind whipping his hair and the sand stinging his face. The sea was no longer merely subdued, it was actively turbulent, dark gray waves crashing with fury against the rocks. The sky overhead was bruised with angry clouds, and the scent of salt and impending storm filled the air. Hans felt a tremor of fear, not just for the weather, but for what Greta's greed was unleashing. He stood at the water's edge, the powerful waves almost reaching his feet, making it difficult to keep his balance. This time, Hans had to shout over the roar of the ocean, his voice thin and strained against the raging elements. "Stella, Stella, come to me. My wife, Greta, has sent Hans to ask a wish of thee." The sea churned violently, as if in protest, and for a long moment, Hans thought Stella, the magical fish, would not appear. Hans felt truly alone against the vast, angry ocean, the magic of the previous encounters replaced by a chilling sense of dread. Hans's heart felt heavy, like a stone in Hans's chest. He felt Greta's desires were making the world around them angry, and Hans did not like that feeling at all.
Stella. Hans is so sorry, Stella. Greta, my wife, is never content. Greta now wants a magnificent castle, Stella.
Go home, Hans. It is already done. Stella hears the growing storm in Greta's heart. Stella grants this wish too.
Oh, Stella! Hans truly hopes Stella can forgive Hans and Greta. Hans feels terrible asking for such a grand thing. Hans truly thinks Greta's desires are getting too big.
Stella, the magical flounder, disappeared into the turbulent waves, and Hans, bracing against the wind, made his way back. The storm seemed to rage not only in the sky, but within the very ground beneath his feet. He could already feel the tremors of the earth shifting, reshaping itself to accommodate Greta's latest, grandest demand. When Hans finally saw their home, his breath caught. The majestic stone house was gone, replaced by an enormous, imposing castle. Its towering turrets reached into the stormy sky. Its formidable stone walls seemed impenetrable, and banners bearing an unfamiliar crest flapped wildly in the gale. A vast moat, spanned by a massive drawbridge, surrounded the fortress. Greta stood on a high balcony, looking down with an air of absolute triumph, a golden crown glinting on her head. She was no longer just a woman in a finer dress. She was a queen, radiating power and command. Hans felt dwarfed by the sheer scale of it all, a mere speck in the shadow of Greta's ambition. He felt a shiver, not of cold, but of a deep, unsettling fear for Greta's soul. Hans approached the castle, feeling like an outsider in his own life. Greta's power was truly astounding, and Hans felt very small next to Greta's grand desires.
Hans! Look, Hans! A castle! Greta is Queen Greta now, Hans. Greta knew Stella, the fish, could do it. Greta demands Hans calls Greta Your Majesty. Your Majesty. Hans is truly amazed. Hans hopes Queen Greta will be happy now. Hans thinks this is very grand, Queen Greta. Happy? Hans? Greta is more than happy. But Greta thinks Queen Greta should be an empress, Hans. Go back to Stella, Hans, and tell Stella to make Queen Greta an empress.
Hans could hardly believe his ears. Empress? He stared up at Queen Greta, whose face was now etched with an even fiercer ambition, her eyes gleaming with insatiable desire. The grandeur of the castle, the weight of the crown, none of it was enough for Greta. The storm outside intensified, mirroring the growing tempest in Greta's heart. Thunder rumbled ominously in the distance, and flashes of lightning illuminated the darkening sky, making the castle seem even more forbidding. Hans's own heart was heavy, sinking lower with each new demand. He tried to speak, to reason with Queen Greta, to remind Queen Greta of the simple joys they once shared in their tiny hut, but Queen Greta merely gestured dismissively. Hans felt a deep, chilling dread. He knew this path of endless wants could only lead to ruin. Hans turned away from the towering castle and Queen Greta's demanding voice, his feet dragging as he once again faced the raging sea. He knew Stella, the magical fish, must be weary of Hans and Greta's constant requests. Hans felt a profound sadness for Queen Greta's inability to find peace, and for Hans's own helplessness in the face of Queen Greta's escalating greed. Hans was truly weary of this journey.
Your Majesty, Hans thinks Empress is a very big title. Hans truly believes Queen Greta has enough. Hans worries for Queen Greta's soul. Nonsense, Hans. Empress Greta will command more. Go, Hans. Tell Stella, the fish, Empress Greta wishes to be an empress.
But Queen Greta, Hans is afraid. The sea is so angry. Hans worries Stella will refuse Hans this time. Hans has a bad feeling about this, Queen Greta.
Hans stumbled through the driving rain, the fierce wind threatening to pull him off his feet.
The sea was a terrifying expanse of churning black water, crashing waves like roaring monsters against the shore. Lightning rent the sky, followed by deafening claps of thunder, and the world seemed to be shaking with raw power. Hans, trembling with fear and exhaustion, forced himself to the water's edge. He had to scream now, his voice raw and desperate, to be heard over the fury of the storm. "Stella! Stella! Come to me! My wife Greta has sent Hans to ask a wish of thee." For a long moment, only the thunder answered, and Hans felt a terrible despair. Then, through the torrential rain, a faint shimmer appeared on the monstrous waves, a tiny beacon of light in the overwhelming darkness. Stella, the magical flounder, rose, her scales still luminous, but her eyes held a profound sadness now, a weary wisdom that pierced Hans's heart. Hans felt a profound shame as Stella looked at Hans. Stella looked truly sorrowful for Hans and for Greta's choices. Hans knew Stella must be tired of granting Greta's wishes.
Hans is so sorry for Hans's wife's unending demands. Greta, my wife, now wants to be an empress, Stella. Hans begs Stella to forgive Hans.
Go home, Hans. It is already done. Stella sees the darkness growing around Greta's heart. Stella grants Greta's wish, but Stella worries.
Thank you, Stella. Hans truly understands Stella's worry. Hans feels it too. Hans wishes Greta would just be content, Stella.
Stella, the magical fish, sank back into the raging sea, leaving Hans to face the wrath of the storm alone. Hans, soaked and shivering, stumbled back towards the castle. The world felt like a tempest, inside and out. As he neared, he saw the transformation. The castle was even grander, more opulent, covered in shimmering gold and jewels, but it felt cold, devoid of warmth. Greta, now Empress Greta, stood on an even higher balcony, surrounded by bowing courtiers and guards, her robes heavy with embroidery, a magnificent diadem sparkling on her head. But her eyes, Hans noticed, still held that restless, hungry glint. She was not truly satisfied. She saw Hans and beckoned him with an imperious gesture, her voice now sharp with command. "Hans, Empress Greta has decided Empress Greta must be Pope." Hans felt his knees almost buckle. The Pope! It was an impossible, blasphemous wish, and the very thought sent shivers of dread down his spine. Hans feared for Empress Greta's sanity, and for what Stella, the magical fish, would say to such an outrageous request. Hans watched Empress Greta, truly worried that Empress Greta would never find true contentment. Hans felt helpless against Empress Greta's escalating greed.
Hans, Empress Greta has decided Empress Greta must be Pope. Go to Stella, Hans, at once. Tell Stella Empress Greta demands to be Pope.
But Empress Greta, Hans cannot ask Stella for that. That is too much, Empress Greta. Hans fears Stella will be truly angry with Hans and Empress Greta for such a wish.
Hans, Empress Greta commands Hans. Go. Empress Greta will wait for Hans to return with the news of Empress Greta's new title.
Hans was numb with despair. To ask Stella, the magical fish, to make Greta the Pope was beyond anything Hans could comprehend. It felt like defying the very order of the world. The storm was at its peak, the sky a terrifying canvas of black and violent lightning. The sea roared like a furious beast, spitting foam and spray high into the air. Hans was sure this was the end, that Stella would finally refuse, or worse, unleash the full fury of her magic upon them. He could barely stand against the gale, his clothes plastered to his skin, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm of fear. He shouted, his voice hoarse, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "Stella, Stella, come to me! My wife Greta has sent Hans to ask a wish of thee." The sea seemed to recoil, and for a moment an eerie silence fell, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. Then Stella, the magical flounder, rose, but this time her light was dim, almost flickering, and her gentle eyes held a deep, profound sorrow that made Hans's own soul ache. Stella looked at Hans, and Hans felt the weight of all Greta's wishes pressing down on Hans. Hans felt truly sorry for Stella, the magical fish, and for all the trouble Hans and Greta had caused Stella. Hans felt a terrible sadness, knowing Greta would never be content.
Stella, Hans can barely speak this. Greta, my wife, now demands to be Pope, Stella. Hans knows this is too much, Stella. Hans is so truly, truly sorry to ask Stella.
Go home, Hans. It is already done. Stella sees the path Greta walks. Stella grants this wish, but Stella's heart is heavy for Greta.
Thank you, Stella, for Stella's patience. Hans truly hopes Stella can still forgive Hans for all of Greta's demands. Hans truly thinks this is enough, Stella.
Stella, the magical flounder, vanished beneath the furious waves, leaving Hans utterly alone in the terrifying tempest. Hans stumbled back towards the castle, his mind reeling. He couldn't imagine what new form their home would take, what new blasphemous grandeur Greta's insatiable desires had conjured. The very air felt thick with foreboding, and the ground trembled beneath his weary feet. When he arrived, the sight was beyond comprehension. The castle had transformed into a towering cathedral, reaching impossibly high into the dark, storm-racked sky. Its spires were adorned with symbols of immense power, and the air thrummed with an unnatural, almost terrifying energy. Greta, now adorned in papal robes and a tiara, sat on a majestic throne, surrounded by cardinals and bishops, her face alight with a dangerous, almost mad glee. But even as Pope Greta, her eyes still held that restless, unsatisfied gleam. She saw Hans, and with a voice that echoed through the vast space, declared her ultimate, most impossible demand. Hans felt the blood drain from Hans's face as Pope Greta spoke. Hans knew this was the end, that Pope Greta had gone too far. Hans's heart was truly filled with fear for Pope Greta's soul. Hans wished for the simple hut again.
Hans, Empress Greta is now Pope Greta. But Hans, Pope Greta has decided Pope Greta wants to be like God. Pope Greta will command the sun and moon. Go to Stella, Hans. Pope Greta, Hans cannot. That is truly impossible. Hans cannot ask Stella, the fish, to make Pope Greta like God. Hans thinks Pope Greta has gone too far this time. Hans, Pope Greta commands Hans. Pope Greta will have Hans thrown into the dungeon if Hans disobeys Pope Greta. Go now, Hans.
Hans's heart seized with terror. To command the sun and moon? It was the ultimate blasphemy, a desire so vast and impossible that it defied all reason and the natural order. Hans felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. He knew with a terrible certainty that this was the breaking point. The sea, which had been merely turbulent, was now a chaotic maelstrom, black as pitch, with waves rising like mountains and crashing down with unimaginable force. The very air shrieked, and Hans felt the world reeling around him. He dragged his weary, trembling body to the water's edge, barely able to stand against the ferocious wind and rain. This time, Hans didn't even try to shout. His voice was a raw whisper, barely audible over the roaring tempest, filled with despair and utter defeat. He collapsed onto his knees, his hands clasped in a silent plea, simply wishing for an end to it all. He knew Stella, the magical fish, must surely be at her limit. Hans felt like all the weight of the world was upon Hans's shoulders, and Hans could not bear Greta's final demand. Hans truly thought this was the end for Hans and Greta. Hans silently called for Stella, not knowing what else to do.
Hans cannot even say it, Stella. Greta, my wife, wishes to be like God, Stella, to command the sun and moon.
Go home, Hans. Stella sees Greta's boundless ambition has reached its peak. Stella sees Greta's heart is empty.
Oh, Stella, Hans truly begs Stella for an end to this. Hans fears for Greta. Hans fears for Hans. Hans just wants peace again, Stella.
Stella,
the magical flounder spoke those simple words, "Go home, Hans." And with a gentle yet profound shimmer, she vanished back into the black churning depths. This time there was no promise of a new grand dwelling, no further transformation. Hans remained kneeling, shivering, waiting for the world to change. But instead of a new, impossibly grander structure, Hans felt a strange stillness descend, a profound quiet replacing the furious roar of the storm. The wind died down, the waves softened to a gentle lapping, and the bruised sky began to clear. Hans slowly rose, his legs weak, and turned to look back. What he saw made his eyes widen with a mix of shock and a strange sense of homecoming. The towering cathedral, the grand castle, the stone house, the cozy cottage, all were gone, vanished. In their place stood their original, tiny, run-down hut, just as it had always been, weathered and humble, nestled by the now calm and shimmering sea. Greta stood outside, staring at it with wide, disbelieving eyes, her magnificent robes and tiara gone, replaced by her simple, worn dress. Hans felt a profound sense of both loss and relief wash over Hans as Hans looked at the familiar, small hut. Hans knew Greta would be very upset, but Hans felt a strange sense of comfort.
Hans, what has Stella the fish done? Greta sees Greta's cathedral is gone. Greta sees Greta's castle is gone. Greta sees Greta's stone house is gone. Greta sees Greta's cottage is gone. What is this, Hans?
Greta, Hans thinks Stella has simply returned us to where we began. Hans thinks Stella, the fish, decided enough was enough for Hans and Greta.
But Hans, Greta had everything. Empress Greta was Pope Greta. Greta was like God. Now Greta has nothing, Hans. Nothing but this miserable hut.
Greta's voice was filled with bitter disappointment, her eyes tearing up with frustration and anger. Hans watched her, a quiet sadness on his face, but also a growing sense of peace. The storm had completely vanished, leaving behind a clear, gentle sky and a sea that sparkled once more under the soft afternoon sun. The air smelled fresh and clean, scrubbed by the recent tempest. Hans gently took Greta's hand, which was now soft and unadorned. Though the hut was tiny and run down, it was warm inside, and the familiar scent of their home enveloped them. The silence, which had been so jarring after the clamor of their grand homes, now felt comforting, a gentle balm to their weary souls. Hans and Greta looked around the small, familiar space. It was just as they had left it, simple and unpretentious. The old, worn fishing net Hans had mended still hung by the door, and the tiny hearth felt inviting. Hans knew Greta was hurting, but Hans hoped Greta would see the simple truth. Hans truly believed Stella, the magical fish, had given Hans and Greta a chance to truly understand what truly mattered, not what glittered and shone. Hans squeezed Greta's hand softly, a silent promise to help Greta find contentment once more. Hans felt a gentle breeze, a whisper of peace.
Greta, Hans knows Greta feels sad. But look, Greta, the sea is calm again. Hans thinks Stella, the fish, has given Hans and Greta a chance to truly rest.
Rest, Hans? Greta feels so much loss, Hans. Greta misses the castle, Hans. Greta misses being powerful.
Hans understands, Greta, but Hans thinks sometimes true power is found in simply appreciating what Hans and Greta already have. This hut, Greta, is our home. Hans thinks it is a good home for Hans and Greta.
Very slowly, the anger and disappointment began to fade from Greta's heart. She looked at Hans, then around their familiar hut, really seeing it for the first time in a long while. The flickering fire in the hearth cast warm shadows, and the scent of the sea drifted gently through the open window. Hans gently touched Greta's arm, his eyes filled with kindness. They sat together, side by side, listening to the soft lapping of the waves, a sound they had once taken for granted. They began to appreciate
the simple peace and quiet that filled their humble home. Realizing that true contentment came not from endless wants or grand titles, but from appreciating the love and comfort they already possessed. The memory of the grand castles and crowns faded like a distant dream, replaced by the warmth of their small, real home. Hans and Greta found a new kind of happiness in their simple life, a peace that wealth and power could never provide. The sea outside whispered its ancient secrets, a lullaby inviting them to dream of gentle things. Hans smiled at Greta, and Greta smiled back, a genuine, soft smile, finally finding peace in Hans's eyes. And so the fisherman and his wife, Hans and Greta, learned that the greatest treasures are not wished for, but cherished. Captain Bramble hopes all of you find such peace in your own hearts. Good night, little listeners, and sweet dreams.
Greta, Hans thinks the stars look particularly bright tonight. Hans sees Hans in Greta's hut, and Hans feels truly content right here with Greta. Hans. Greta thinks Hans is right. Greta feels a quiet peace Greta hasn't felt in a very long time. Greta truly appreciates this home, Hans, and Greta truly appreciates Hans.
Greta. Hans is so glad Greta feels that way. Hans loves Greta, and Hans loves our home. Don't forget to subscribe to Go Read Link Stories.